The sun was setting at Los Angeles International Airport as Flight 247 prepared for its journey to Chicago. Captain Mike Thompson stood at the cockpit door, greeting passengers with a warm smile as they boarded. It was a routine he'd followed for the past 20 years, and he took pride in making everyone feel welcome aboard his aircraft. The boarding process was going smoothly until he heard loud laughter and heavy footsteps coming up the jet bridge. 5 burly men in leather jackets pushed their way through, their boots thudding against the airplane's floor. The patches on their jackets identified them as members of the Road Warriors, a motorcycle club known for causing trouble across the West Coast. "Move it, Grandma." One of them barked at an elderly lady who was carefully storing her carry-on bag. The woman flinched, clutching her purse closer. Mike's jaw tightened, but he maintained his professional demeanor. After all, he'd handled all sorts of passengers during his long career. The bikers made their way to first class, leaving a trail of muttered complaints and uncomfortable glances in their wake. Their leader, a mountain of a man with a shaved head and a massive snake tattoo crawling up his neck, paused briefly near the cockpit. He sized up Mike with small, calculating eyes before breaking into a mocking grin. "Hey boys," he called out to his friends, "looks like we got ourselves a real Top Gun up here." The other bikers snickered, and Mike could smell the alcohol on their breath. They must have spent quite some time at the airport bar before boarding. As Mike went through his pre-flight checks, he couldn't help but notice the growing unease among the cabin crew. Jenny, his lead flight attendant of 5 years, approached with concern written all over her face. "Those guys in first class," she whispered, "they're already demanding drinks, and we haven't even taken off yet." Mike nodded thoughtfully. In his 2 decades of flying, he'd learned to trust his instincts. Something about these passengers felt different from the usual troublemakers. The way they carried themselves, their coordinated movements, the subtle hand signals they exchanged, it reminded him of his time in the Marines, but not in a good way. As the final passengers settled in, Mike made his routine welcome announcement. The bikers interrupted with exaggerated yawns and loud comments, causing nervous laughter from some passengers and disapproving looks from others. A young mother held her child closer, while a businessman in row 7 pretended to be deeply engrossed in his magazine. Through the cockpit's open door, Mike could hear snippets of their conversation. They were planning something. What exactly, he couldn't tell, but their hushed tones and occasional bursts of laughter sent a chill down his spine. 20 years of commercial flying had taught him to read situations, and this one was reading like a storm warning. The sun had completely set now, casting long shadows through the cabin windows. As Mike prepared for takeoff, he thought about his options. He could radio ahead and have security meet them in Chicago, but that might not be enough. He could divert the flight, but that would need solid justification. For now, he would watch and wait, keeping his military training and experience as an ace up his sleeve. Little did these bikers know that the man they just mocked wasn't just any pilot. Before joining commercial aviation, Mike had spent 15 years as a Marine Corps fighter pilot, handling situations far more intense than this. He'd learned that the best strategy was often patience, waiting for the right moment to act. As the engines roared to life and the plane began its taxi to the runway, Mike could feel the tension building in the cabin behind him. This was shaping up to be anything but a routine flight, and he had a feeling that his experience, both as a pilot and a Marine, would be put to the test before they reached Chicago. 3 hours into the flight, the cabin's atmosphere had shifted from uneasy to unbearable. The 5 bikers had made themselves at home in first class, turning it into their personal party zone. The smell of expensive whiskey hung in the air. They'd somehow convinced a nervous flight attendant to keep the drinks coming, despite airline policy. Jenny, the lead flight attendant, watched with growing concern as they got louder with each passing hour. She'd been flying this route for 8 years and had dealt with her share of difficult passengers, but something about these men set off warning bells. It wasn't just their appearance or even their behavior. It was the calculated way they watched the crew's movements, like predators studying their prey. "Hey, sweetheart." The one they called Big Pete bellowed, snapping his fingers at Jenny. "Another round for me and my brothers." His leather vest was now unzipped, revealing a faded t-shirt underneath. The other passengers in first class had given up any pretense of sleep, sitting rigid in their seats, eyes fixed on their screens or magazines. In row 3, an elderly couple who'd saved up for their anniversary trip sat holding hands, flinching every time the bikers burst into raucous laughter. The husband, a retired schoolteacher by the looks of him, had tried to catch Jenny's eye several times, but what could she really do? The situation was delicate. One wrong move could make things worse. Mike, up in the cockpit, was getting regular updates through the intercom. Each report made his jaw clench a little tighter. The bikers had started wandering into coach class, supposedly to use the bathroom, but really to intimidate other passengers. A businessman had complained about them blocking the aisle, only to quickly retract his complaint when Snake, their leader, had given him what he called a friendly pat on the shoulder. "Captain," Jenny's voice crackled through his headset, "we've got another situation." She explained how one of the bikers had accidentally spilled his drink on a young woman's laptop, then offered to make it up to her in ways that made her visibly uncomfortable. The woman's boyfriend had started to stand up, but another biker's stern look had quickly changed his mind. Mike checked his instruments, more out of habit than necessity. They were cruising at 35,000 feet, somewhere over the Midwest's patchwork of farms and small towns. The night sky outside was clear, stars twinkling innocently above the brewing storm inside his aircraft. He thought about his own daughter, who often flew alone for business. The thought of her being in a situation like this made his blood boil. The breaking point came when Jenny rushed to the cockpit, her professional composure finally cracking. "They're telling stories about their prison time," she whispered, making sure everyone around them can hear. "Mrs. Chen, the elderly lady in 3B, is having chest pains from anxiety. Her husband says she has a heart condition." Through the cockpit door, Mike could hear Snake's voice rising above the engine noise. "You know what happened to the last guy who disrespected our club?" Followed by cruel laughter. A baby started crying in coach class, and instead of their usual sympathy, passengers seemed relieved. The sound covered up the bikers' increasingly threatening conversations. Mike had been monitoring the radio chatter from other flights, keeping one ear on the cabin noise while maintaining their course. He'd already logged 3 incident reports, carefully documenting each escalation. Years of military service had taught him the importance of proper documentation, but it had also taught him to recognize when a situation was about to boil over. One of the younger flight attendants, Tom, appeared at the cockpit door. His tie was slightly askew, and his normally cheerful face was drawn with worry. "Sir," he said quietly, "they're asking about you now." "The big one, Snake, he's telling everyone how he's going to teach the pilots some respect when we land." Mike nodded slowly, his mind already working through scenarios and solutions. The threats weren't just hot air anymore, they were becoming specific and personal. As a commercial pilot, his first responsibility was the safety of his passengers and crew. As a former Marine, he knew that sometimes the best defense was a carefully planned offense. He looked at his watch, then at their flight path displayed on the screen. They were still 2 hours from Chicago, but there were several airports within range. More importantly, there were certain facilities along their route that most passengers didn't know about. Places where law enforcement would be more than happy to welcome unexpected visitors. The plane hit a small pocket of turbulence, sending drinks sloshing in the cabin. The bikers' loud whoops at the disturbance were cut short by a sharp cry. Someone had been burned by spilled coffee. As Jenny hurried back to handle the situation, Mike made his decision. It was time to show these troublemakers that they'd picked the wrong flight, the wrong crew, and definitely the wrong pilot to mess with. The moment Mike stepped out of the cockpit for his routine cabin check, he could feel the shift in atmosphere. The first-class cabin, usually a haven of quiet luxury, had been transformed into something that felt more like a rowdy bar at closing time. Empty drink glasses littered the tray tables, and the air was thick with tension. As he made his way down the aisle, Mike noticed how other passengers quickly averted their eyes, trying to make themselves invisible. A young mother in row 4 pulled her sleeping child closer as he passed. These small gestures told him everything he needed to know about how the situation had deteriorated. Snake, sprawled across 2 first-class seats like they were his personal throne, noticed Mike's approach. The biker's leather vest was now completely open, revealing a faded t-shirt with an image that made several nearby passengers uncomfortable. He nudged his buddies, and the conversation dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "Well, well," Snake drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear. Look who decided to join the party. He stood up slowly, using his full height to tower over the aisle. Mike noted how the movement wasn't as clumsy as it should have been for someone who'd supposedly been drinking heavily. This guy was putting on a show. Big Pete and the others shifted in their seats, forming a loose circle around their leader. Their choreographed movements reminded Mike of formation flying. Each person knew exactly where they needed to be. These weren't just random troublemakers, they operated like a unit. "Enjoying your flight, gentlemen?" Mike asked, keeping his voice professional and steady. He'd learned during his military years that tone was everything in tense situations. Too friendly could be seen as weakness, too authoritative could trigger aggression. Snake took a step closer, deliberately invading Mike's personal space. The smell of whiskey was there, but his eyes were clear and calculating. We're having a great time, aren't we, boys?" The others chuckled on cue, just wondering why our drinks stopped coming. "Flight regulations," Mike replied simply. "We need to ensure everyone's safety." Snake's face twisted into something between a smirk and a snarl. He accidentally bumped into Mike, sending a half-full glass of whiskey cascading down the pilot's pristine uniform. The amber liquid spread across the blue fabric like a stain on a clear sky. The cabin went silent. Even the constant hum of the engines seemed to fade away as everyone held their breath. A child somewhere in coach class asked a question in a loud whisper, quickly shushed by their parent. "Oops," Snake said, his voice dripping with fake concern. "My hand slipped. Guess you'll have to change before we land in Chicago." The threat in his words was clear. They were planning something for when the plane touched down. Mike looked down at his soaked uniform, then back up at Snake. 20 years of commercial flying had taught him to keep his cool, but 15 years as a Marine had taught him to recognize a direct challenge. The way Snake emphasized Chicago confirmed Mike's suspicions. These guys were counting on reaching their destination. Behind Snake, his crew had spread out slightly, using the confined space of the cabin to their advantage. To the casual observer, they were just shifting in their seats, but Mike recognized the tactical positioning. They were cutting off his escape routes, probably without even realizing they were using military-style strategies. A flight attendant appeared at the back of first class, worry etched on his face. Mike gave him a supple hand signal, one he'd learned years ago in combat situations, to stay back. The young man's eyes widened slightly with understanding, and he retreated to the galley. "No need to change," Mike said, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "Been through worse turbulence than this." The double meaning wasn't lost on Snake, whose confident smirk flickered for just a moment. As Mike turned to head back to the cockpit, he heard Snake call out, "Hey pilot, better hope Chicago's nice and peaceful when we land. Would hate for anything to disturb your perfect safety record." Mike kept walking, his shoes leaving damp footprints on the carpet from the spilled whiskey. But his mind was already racing ahead, formulating a plan. These bikers thought they had the upper hand because they'd marked their territory in the cabin. What they didn't know was that up here, at 35,000 feet, the real territory belonged to the pilot. And Mike was about to remind them of that fact in a way they'd never forget. Back in the cockpit, Mike's whiskey-stained uniform was the least of his concerns. As he settled into his seat, memories from his previous life flashed through his mind. The bikers had made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed he was just another commercial pilot. Looking down at his hands on the controls, Mike remembered different controls, different missions. Before he wore this airline uniform, he'd worn a different one, the uniform of a Marine Corps fighter pilot. For 15 years, he'd flown combat missions in some of the world's most dangerous places. The skills he'd learned they had never really left him. They'd just been sleeping, waiting for a moment like this. His co-pilot, Randy, glanced over with concern. "Everything all right back there?" he asked, noticing the wet uniform and Mike's thoughtful expression. Randy was young, just a few years into his commercial career. He hadn't been around long enough to learn that sometimes the most dangerous situations came from inside the plane, not outside it. "Those bikers think they've got it all figured out," Mike said quietly, checking their flight path on the display. "They're planning something for Chicago." He zoomed in on the map, a plan already forming in his mind. "But they don't know what I know about this route." What the troublemakers in first class didn't realize was that this particular flight path had some interesting neighbors. Mike had memorized every airport, every landing strip, and every restricted airspace along this route. But more importantly, he knew about the facilities that didn't show up on regular maps, places he'd visited during his military career. He thought about his time in the Marines, not with nostalgia, but with gratitude for the training. 3 tours in combat zones had taught him more than just how to fly. He'd learned how to read people, how to spot patterns, and most importantly, how to think 3 steps ahead of any threat. Mike remembered his last combat mission, flying through a sandstorm to deliver crucial supplies to a stranded unit. That day, he'd learned that sometimes the best way to handle a crisis wasn't with force, but with strategy. The same principle would apply here, at 35,000 feet above the American heartland. Running his hand along the control panel, Mike thought about all the nights he'd spent studying maps of this route. Commercial pilots were required to know their flight paths inside and out, but his military background had pushed him to learn more. He knew every air traffic control center, every military installation, and every emergency landing site within range. The biker's confident swaggers and tough guy acts didn't impress him. He'd seen real tough guys, Marines who'd carried wounded comrades through firefights, pilots who'd flown damaged aircraft to save their crews, medics who'd worked under impossible conditions to save lives. Those experiences had taught him that true strength wasn't about intimidation, it was about staying calm and using your head when things got rough. Looking at their current position on the radar, Mike allowed himself a small smile. Snake and his crew thought they had the upper hand because they controlled the cabin. What they didn't understand was that up here, in the dark sky above America's heartland, Mike had access to resources they couldn't even imagine. He reached for the radio, then paused, remembering a lesson from his squadron commander years ago. The element of surprise isn't just about weapons or tactics, it's about making your opponent realize, too late, that they never really knew what they were up against. The flight path display showed several possible landing sites within range, but there was one in particular that caught Mike's attention, one that brought back memories of joint training exercises and shared missions. He hadn't contacted his old military buddies in a while, but he knew they'd be more than happy to help with this situation. Randy noticed Mike studying the navigation screen. "Something wrong with our route?" he asked, still unaware of the full situation developing in the cabin. Mike shook his head slowly, a plan crystallizing in his mind. "Nothing wrong," he replied, his voice calm and confident. "But I think it's time these guys learned an important lesson about judging books by their covers." He began making some calculations, factoring in fuel consumption, wind patterns, and distance to various airports. Years of military precision had taught him to leave nothing to chance. The bikers back in first class had no idea that while they were celebrating what they thought was their dominance over a simple commercial pilot, they'd actually picked a fight with someone who'd spent years handling situations far more intense than this. As Mike reached for the radio to put his plan into action, he couldn't help but think that sometimes life had a way of teaching people exactly the lessons they needed to learn. Mike's fingers moved smoothly across the radio controls, muscle memory from thousands of flights guiding his actions. He'd made plenty of calls to air traffic control over the years, but this one would be special. First, though, he needed to set the stage perfectly. Reaching for the cabin intercom, he cleared his throat and pressed the button. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." His voice was calm and professional, giving no hint of the plan forming in his mind. "We're experiencing some minor mechanical issues that require our attention. Nothing serious, but we may need to make an unscheduled landing. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Through the cockpit door, he could hear the immediate reaction. Worried murmurs from most passengers, but loud, mocking laughter from the bikers. "Looks like Top Gun can't handle his bird." Snake's voice carried clearly through the cabin. His crew joined in with more taunts, thinking they'd somehow won. Randy, the co-pilot, shot Mike a questioning look. There were no mechanical issues. The plane was running perfectly. Mike held up a hand, signaling him to wait, then switched to a different radio frequency, one that wasn't used for regular commercial traffic. "Thunder Base, this is Sierra 739er, he said quietly, using a call sign he hadn't used in years. There was a moment of static, then a surprised voice answered. "Sierra 739er, this is Thunder Base. Been a while, Captain Thompson. What can we do for you?" As Mike explained the situation, he could hear the growing interest in the controller's voice. Thunder Base, officially known as Scott Air Force Base, had been a regular stop during his Marine Corps days. They specialized in handling unusual situations, and this one definitely qualified. Understood, Sierra? The controller replied, professionalism not quite hiding his enthusiasm. We'd be happy to provide assistance. We've got a welcoming committee that would love to meet your special passengers. Mike switched back to regular air traffic control to officially request the diversion. Years of experience helped him craft the perfect explanation, just technical enough to be believable, just vague enough to avoid questions. Meanwhile, Randy began adjusting their flight path, understanding now what his captain had in mind. In the cabin, the flight attendants had started their preparation for landing routine. Jenny, catching Mike's eye through the cockpit door, gave a subtle nod. She'd worked enough flights with him to know he wouldn't make this decision without good reason. Ladies and gentlemen, Mike announced again, we'll be landing at an alternate airport to address our mechanical concerns. We apologize for any inconvenience and appreciate your patience. He could practically feel Snake and his crew smirking, probably thinking they'd intimidated him into landing early. The bikers didn't notice the slight course change, too busy celebrating what they thought was their victory. They didn't realize that instead of heading to Chicago's O'Hare International Airport, they were now approaching a very different kind of runway. Through the clouds below, the lights of a small city twinkled. Most passengers assumed it was just another Midwest town, but Mike knew better. He'd spent countless hours on the base that lay just outside those city limits, training with some of the best pilots and security forces in the military. As they began their descent, Mike could hear Snake and his crew getting louder, probably planning whatever trouble they intended to cause when they landed. They had no idea that the real surprise was waiting for them on the ground. The plane broke through a layer of clouds, and the runway lights came into view. To most passengers, they looked like any other airport lights. But Mike could see the subtle differences, the slightly different pattern, the military precision of their spacing. More importantly, he could see the vehicles already gathering near the runway, their red and blue lights flashing in the evening darkness. 10 minutes to landing, he announced, allowing himself a small smile as he heard the bikers laughing about their plans to teach the pilot a lesson once they were on the ground. They still hadn't noticed that the approaching airport looked nothing like O'Hare. Randy handled the landing preparations, while Mike made one final call to Thunder Base. Sierra 739er, final approach. Welcoming committee in position. The response was immediate and clear. Affirmative, Sierra. We've got quite a reception planned for your friends. As the plane descended through the last layer of clouds, Mike thought about Snake's earlier taunt about hoping Chicago would be peaceful when they landed. Well, they weren't going to Chicago anymore, and peaceful wasn't exactly the word he used to describe the welcome these troublemakers were about to receive. The landing gear deployed with a reassuring thud, and Mike could feel the familiar sensation of the plane preparing to touch down. In all his years of flying, both military and commercial, he'd never looked forward to a landing quite as much as this one. Sometimes, he thought, the best way to handle bullies wasn't to fight them, it was to show them they'd picked on the wrong person, in the wrong place, at exactly the wrong time. The landing gear kissed the runway with barely a bump, one of Mike's smoothest touchdowns ever. As the plane rolled to a gentle stop, the cabin erupted with the usual smattering of applause from relieved passengers. The bikers, still thinking they were at Chicago O'Hare, started gathering their things, laughing about their plans for the evening ahead. Through the cockpit window, Mike could see the welcoming committee taking their positions. The flashing lights of military police vehicles cast red and blue shadows across the tarmac. He noticed the familiar silhouettes of Air Force Security Forces personnel, their stance professional and ready. Just another day at Scott Air Force Base, but a day these troublemakers wouldn't soon forget. Ladies and gentlemen, Mike's voice came clear through the intercom. Welcome to Scott Air Force Base, Illinois. For those unfamiliar, this is a United States military installation. Please remain in your seats until our ground crew gives us clearance to deplane. The silence that followed was deafening. In first class, Snake's face went from confusion to shock as he looked out the window, finally noticing the military vehicles and armed personnel surrounding the aircraft. Gone was the smug grin he'd worn throughout the flight, replaced by a dawning realization that things had just taken an unexpected turn. "This ain't O'Hare," Big Pete muttered, pressing his face against the window. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their earlier bravado evaporating like morning dew under a hot sun. Jenny, the lead flight attendant, couldn't hide her smile as she walked through the cabin. "Please remain seated," she announced, her confidence restored. "Military police will be boarding shortly to assist with deplaning procedures." The regular passengers, understanding now what their pilot had done, exchanged knowing looks and subtle smiles. The elderly couple who'd endured hours of harassment sat holding hands, watching with satisfaction as uniformed officers boarded the plane. The young mother who'd been protecting her child now relaxed, telling her curious little one, "See? The pilot knew exactly what to do to keep us safe." Through the cockpit door, Mike could hear the methodical boots of military police making their way down the aisle. There was no rush, no drama, just the calm, professional execution of law enforcement doing their job. He heard one officer's clear voice, "Gentlemen, we'll need you to come with us. We've got some questions about your behavior during this flight." Snake tried one last time to maintain his tough guy image. "You can't do this. We've got rights." His voice had lost its earlier menace, replaced by something closer to panic. The military police officer's response was calm but firm. "Sir, interfering with a flight crew is a federal offense. We take that very seriously here. Now, you can either walk off this plane with us quietly, or we can make this much more complicated. Your choice." One by one, the bikers were escorted off the plane. Their leather vests and tough attitudes seemed much less impressive under the watchful eyes of trained military personnel. As they passed the cockpit, Mike stood in the doorway, his whiskey-stained uniform now a badge of honor rather than an insult. Snake paused briefly, finally getting a good look at the pilot he'd underestimated. Mike's stance, his calm demeanor, the way the military police nodded to him with respect, it all finally clicked. "You're not just a pilot, are you?" Snake asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mike smiled slightly. 15 years Marine Corps fighter pilot, 3 combat tours. "But you're right about one thing, I'm not just a pilot. I'm the captain of this aircraft, and that means the safety of everyone on board is my responsibility." The regular passengers watched through their windows as the bikers were led to waiting military vehicles. The young businessman who'd been too afraid to complain earlier turned to his seatmate and said, "Now that's what I call karma." As the last of the troublemakers was escorted away, a senior Air Force officer approached the plane. Mike recognized him immediately, Colonel Richards, an old friend from his Marine Corps days. The colonel gave him a knowing smile and a subtle thumbs up. The remaining passengers were allowed to deplane normally, many stopping to thank Mike personally. The elderly gentleman who'd been protecting his wife all flight shook Mike's hand with tears in his eyes. "Young man," he said, "that was the smartest handling of bullies I've seen in my 70 years. Randy, the co-pilot, finally let out a long whistle. "You know, when they cover emergency procedures in flight school, they never mention anything like this." Mike checked his watch. They were only slightly behind schedule. A quick refueling, and they'd be back on their way to Chicago. Sometimes, he thought, a small detour was worth it to remind people that appearances could be deceiving, and that true authority came not from intimidation, but from staying cool under pressure and knowing exactly when and how to act. News of what happened on Flight 247 spread faster than a summer wildfire. By the time the plane finally landed in Chicago, 2 hours later than scheduled, social media was already buzzing with stories from passengers who couldn't wait to share their experience. "Best flight delay ever," wrote one passenger, attaching a photo of the military vehicle's flashing lights at Scott Air Force Base. Our pilot turned out to be an ex-Marine who knew exactly how to handle some troublemakers. Didn't raise his voice once, just served them the biggest slice of humble pie I've ever seen. The airline's corporate office was flooded with messages, not with complaints about the delay, but with praise for Captain Mike Thompson's handling of the situation. One email came from the elderly couple in first class. "In our 50 years of flying, we've never felt safer. That young man didn't just protect us, he showed everyone that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one you shouldn't underestimate." The story caught the attention of local news stations, then national ones. Headlines read, quick-thinking pilot turns tables on mile-high bullies, and former Marine shows how to handle trouble at 35,000 feet. But Mike wasn't interested in the spotlight. He simply filed his incident report, completed his paperwork, and prepared for his next flight. The airline's security team used the incident as a case study in their training programs. Notice how Captain Thompson never escalated the situation, the trainer would point out. He used his knowledge and resources to solve the problem without putting anyone at risk. That's the kind of thinking we want to encourage. A week later, Mike received a letter from the Air Force Base Commander. Your handling of the situation was textbook perfect. Those men are facing federal charges for interfering with a flight crew, and several of them had outstanding warrants. Sometimes karma needs a little help finding its target. The flight attendants who'd been on duty that day created a special thank you card. Jenny, who'd kept her cool throughout the ordeal, wrote, "You showed us that true leadership isn't about being the toughest or the loudest. It's about staying calm and using your head when things get rough." Even some of the other pilots started joking about it during their pre-flight briefings. "Remember, if you get any trouble up there, just channel your inner Captain Thompson," they'd say with a laugh. Turns out military bases make great unscheduled stops. The young mother from the flight sent in a drawing her child had made, showing the plane surrounded by police cars with flashing lights. "My kid now wants to be a pilot when they grow up," her note read. "Not because of the flying, but because you showed them that real heroes don't need capes. Sometimes they just need stripes on their shoulders and a cool head." The story became a topic of discussion in flight schools. Instructors used it to teach new pilots that aviation wasn't just about flying the plane, it was about being ready for anything and knowing how to use every resource at your disposal. A few months later, Mike ran into Colonel Richards again during a layover. "You know," the colonel said with a grin, "those bikers still talk about that day." Turns out spending a night in military police custody gave them a new perspective on life. Their leader, Snake, he actually apologized to the MPs before they were transferred to federal custody. The incident changed things in subtle ways. Passengers started paying more attention during pre-flight introductions, wondering about the stories behind the calm voices on the intercom. Flight attendants felt more confident knowing their pilots had their backs. And somewhere out there, a group of bikers learned an important lesson about judging people by their uniforms. But for Mike, the biggest change was the quiet nods of respect he now got from passengers who'd heard the story. He didn't need the recognition. He'd just done what any good pilot would do. Still, it felt good knowing that sometimes the good guys won without having to throw a single punch. As he prepared for another flight, straightening his fresh uniform and doing his pre-flight checks, Mike thought about what his old Marine commander used to say. "The best victories are the ones where nobody gets hurt, and everybody learned something." Looking back at what happened that day, he couldn't have planned it better if he'd tried. The story of Flight 247 became a legend in aviation circles, not because of any dramatic action, but because it showed that sometimes the best way to handle a tough situation was with brains instead of brawn. And somewhere in the skies over America, Captain Mike Thompson still greets every passenger who boards his plane with the same calm smile, ready for whatever the flight might bring.